Lauren Schaal is a second-year law student and legal advocate at the Boston Area Rape Crisis Center and Casa Mirna Vazquez. After spending time working on the Navajo Nation reservation, she has honed her focus to Native American sexual assault and abuse. If she can ever get away from her law school work, she enjoys painting and falling on her butt in yoga class. Lauren?
This past year, America has begun the most public conversation about domestic and sexual violence it has ever had. From Columbia student Emma Solkowitz carrying the mattress she was raped on around her campus, to chilling Super Bowl commercials, to President Obama interrupting the Grammys to talk about it. This country has taken huge strides in recognizing that domestic and sexual violence are problems. However, the group affected the most by this problem has been conspicuously absent from the conversation entirely. American Indian women are 2.5 times more likely to be raped than any other racial or ethnic group in the country. Even more alarming, they are murdered at 10 times the rate of the national average. Their perpetrators are overwhelmingly non-Indian men. While America is beginning a conversation about its own domestic and sexual violence, it is ignoring the epidemic in Indian country. For the past 7 years, I have been a domestic violence advocate and rape crisis counselor. I have seen women go through hell, but nothing compares to the harsh reality I faced when working in the Navajo Nation last year on a pro bono legal trip. There I learned that these rates are so sky high because perpetrators cannot be prosecuted on tribal court lands, therefore leaving no outlet for justice. In 2013, the Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act, or VAWA, attempted to close this legal loophole by providing tribes the jurisdiction over domestic and sexual crimes. This just went into effect last month. While seemingly the solution, and then I can just get off the stage, it's not the solution. It actually creates more problems and has damaging, lasting impacts on tribal sovereignty and their ability to bring justice to their reservations. For the past year, I have studied the perpetual cycle of violence against Indian women, and I believe that there is a solution. I'll first explain the history of Indian jurisdiction and the problems with VAWA's current fix, before using its idea to create a workable solution to this frightening epidemic. To begin, the U.S. federal government has historically had a, to put it lightly, difficult relationship with American Indian tribes. Since colonization, sovereignty, or the ability to be a totally separate, self-governing nation has steadily decreased for American Indian tribes across the country. 3 Supreme Court cases in the early 1800s solidified that American Indians would never be seen as sovereign again. In them, Chief Justice Marshall wrote that American Indian tribes are distinct, independent political communities, yet still limited the types of legal issues they would be able to resolve by themselves, and instead gave more and more power to the U.S. federal government. Currently, American Indian tribes can only hear a criminal case if both parties are Indian. If the perpetrator is American Indian, but the victim is not, the federal government can either take the case for themselves, give it to a tribal court, or decline to hear it altogether. However, when the victim is American Indian and the perpetrator is not, tribal courts don't even have this option to be able to take the case. This jurisdictional gap further hurts domestic and sexual violence victims because U.S. attorneys decline to take over half of violent crime cases in Indian country. Compare that declination rate to the rest of the United States, where prosecutors start cases on over 80% of violent crimes. Tribal inability to hold perpetrators accountable on their own lands leaves them helpless to stop this cycle of violence. And thus, non-Indian perpetrators now account for almost 70% of all domestic and sexual violence crimes done on reservations. Furthermore, these abusers and rapists feel free to continue to commit violence because there isn't even a threat of prosecution. VAWA's remedy to this was to create tribal jurisdiction for domestic and sexual crimes as they related to non-Indians. However, this further compounds the issue because the law was written assuming tribal courts look just like federal courts. Now, this is simply not true. The goal of the federal judicial system is for one person to be deemed a winner and the other responsible. However, conversely, many tribes feel that in order for justice to be served, all parties must take responsibility. With such a basic difference in understanding justice, it's no surprise that these court systems look incredibly different. Take the Navajo Nation, for example. While their judicial branch includes Americanized court systems, part of it is a peacemaking program. Now, this program doesn't have plaintiffs and defendants, but instead invites everyone in the community who feels affected by a problem to come and talk about it. Though successful for Navajo domestic violence cases, there is no due process, nor anything that even resembles a trial. Furthermore, in their more Americanized court systems, Navajo judges and lawyers do not have to pass an ABA certified bar exam in order to practice law, thus potentially denying non-Indian defendants their right to counsel. The authors of VAWA were correct in realizing that this issue needed to be addressed by legislation. However, in their haste to do so, they may have potentially taken away the opportunity to utilize this jurisdiction at all. For instance, if a tribe were to utilize this new jurisdiction and convict a non-Indian, that non-Indian has the ability to seek redress in a federal court, stating that his rights were taken away. If a case like this were to be seen in the Supreme Court, they are likely to strike the entire jurisdiction down as unconstitutional, leaving American Indians with not just a shaky jurisdiction, but no jurisdiction at all. Thankfully, solutions do exist, and they lie in changing both the Violence Against Women Act and tribal structure together. First, VAWA is up for reauthorization in 2018, and changes can and should be made. In order to create a truly effective difference, VAWA's language needs to be tweaked, and it must provide funds to tribal governments interested in implementing this new jurisdiction. The provisions of VAWA are written with very sweeping language about constitutional rights and due process, which is not only literally foreign to American Indian governments, but it also invites hefty constitutional challenges. For example, VAWA wants every non-Indian defendant to be able to have a jury with a pool of non-Indian jurors. How can a reservation call somebody who doesn't even live on the reservation nor go along with the tribe to jury duty? You know, what is a non-Indian who lives on the reservation, who follows tribal practices, even considered? You know, the language of VAWA needs to address these more specific questions and implement mechanisms in order to do so. Additionally, VAWA must also focus on giving tribal grants so tribes can afford to make the changes necessary to provide these constitutional rights to non-Indians. VAWA currently gives over $412 million in order to help stop and end domestic and sexual violence. However, not 1 cent of that goes to this tribal jurisdiction. Specific grants need to be created in order to help tribes afford the changes that VAWA is asking for. For instance, a tribe has to actually go to the federal government to ask to utilize this jurisdiction. If asked, VAWA could then give them a financial package to help make the transition smoother. In this capacity, they would not only be setting out much more specific steps with the language changes, but they would also be giving tribes the means to implement this. Additionally, tribal structure also needs to make compromises. While it is completely unrealistic and unnecessary for tribal courts to completely Americanize their judicial system, they need to keep their traditional values. However, many tribes do things one day at a time. For instance, on Tuesdays, a tribe might hear property disputes. This is an easy way to allocate difficult resources on reservations. If this was implemented with this new jurisdiction, it would limit the days that qualified judges and lawyers would have to work in the court systems, thus being a great compromise not only for their limited resources, but also allow them to keep important traditional values throughout the time. With both VAWA's language changing as well as giving money to reservations, and them making the compromises necessary to be able to actually try non-Indians, justice can actually be served, and hopefully these sky-high rates will begin to decline. Now, America is beginning a very important conversation about domestic and sexual violence. However, it is imperative that American Indians are included in this conversation. We looked at the jurisdiction of American Indians and the problems with VAWA before understanding how things just need a little tweak in order for real justice to be served. But it is going to take every single person in this room to begin to include American Indians in our conversations about domestic and sexual violence, because they need to be a part of the conversation about the problem before they can be a part of the solution. Thank you.